Hey there, welcome to class 1 of our Get AQUA-inted Masterclass. I'm Chrissy and I'm going to take you through all of the classes. So I'm just going to show you real quick. These are similar to the cards that we are going to make today. I made 2 ahead of time just so I could show you a sample of exactly what we were going to do. So we're going to create simple backgrounds. It's going to be using a wash, which is basically just adding plain water and then color. You can kind of see how it fades. It's almost like an ombre effect. This one's a little bit lighter because I used a light blue and the other one was a green. Strictly using aqua markers. These are the markers. I did not use watercolors. I only used these markers. So I want to show you that you can get the same effects that you get with watercolors by using Spectrum aqua markers. So I'm going to show you here that you have 2 ends with these markers. You have a nice thick brush end as well as a real fine tip on there. So the fine tip is great for real detailed areas if you actually want to color direct onto something, which I do once in a while. I tend not to. What we're going to do in this lesson and what I do for a lot of my watercoloring is I use a palette instead and treat these more as paints. But you can see that you have 2 options here. So when you do want to add the marker direct to your watercolor paper, you get a real vibrant color and you have 2 options. You have the thick and then you have the real thin. Now you can see it covers really well. You don't need to add like a bunch of layers or anything like that to cover an area. They blend pretty nicely. You just want to make sure that when you're using Spectrum Aquas, you use only watercolor paper. So again, we're treating these basically as watercolor paints. So I'm pulling out a brush and some water. I'm going to show you 2 ways to create the same background. So I have my acrylic block, and this is how I mentioned I use like a palette. My acrylic block becomes a palette. Chances are if you're a stamper, you have an acrylic block laying around. But if you don't, you can use a laminated sheet of paper. If you do have anything else that's acrylic, even like packaging for something or the back of like a stamp set, you can use that too. So anything laminated or acrylic. So what I'm going to do first, I'm going to create a wash. Now, honestly, it's probably easier if you use a really big brush. But I just decided I was going to keep it similar because I'm also going to use a water brush later, and I wanted to show you how to do it with the paintbrush and the water brush. So I kept them a similar size. If you want to cover your entire panel, probably a big brush is best. So by adding the plain clean water, it's called a wash. And so now we are just going to go and we're going to start adding color. And you can see I'm just adding it at the top and it's just kind of fading out like regular watercolors do. So we're going to continue to go ahead and add more and more color. Just at the top, and then I'm just kind of pulling it down. You can see with my brush it's just kind of fading out, and it does look really light right now. I did have kind of bright lighting as well. In person I think it is a little bit heavier in color, a little more saturated. So you can see too, if you make a mistake or anything, you can take a paper towel and basically like blot the color off and it'll pretty much come off. So these do take a little bit of practice getting used to. Now, if you're familiar with watercoloring already, if you have watercolored before, the learning curve is definitely less. If you've never watercolored, I feel that this is a great way to get started because you do have a lot of control. So you can see now I'm just adding the red in and I'm doing the exact same thing. I'm just kind of blending it into the purple, just going up and down, back and forth, continuously adding water. So we're going to get a really pretty background that goes from like a darker purple to a light purple and then down to the red. And I'm not going to go over the entire panel. I just kind of wanted this at the top. By all means, if you want to continue all the way down, you certainly can. You can cover your entire panel in color if you want. You don't even have to make it fade. If you're not comfortable with that, if you just want to do the real basic, I'm just adding color and that's that, go for it. So the one thing about watercoloring though is that your paper will start warping, and what that means is going to kind of start curling up because the more water we're adding, we're kind of torturing the paper. So I almost always keep a heat gun with me, and as I'm adding layers, I throw the heat gun on there. And sometimes I flip the paper over as well because it does kind of curl. So I actually add the heat on the back side as well to kind of like flatten out the paper. Now, if you have time, it'd be great to do this and then when you're actually done watercoloring, because this is going to be a panel, let it sit for a while underneath something heavy so it completely flattens out. But if you don't have time, you can certainly just go ahead and use the heat gun and just use a really strong adhesive to kind of fight that curl. Another option is you can cut your panel bigger, and then you can tape it down with like painter's tape or washi tape to like a clipboard or another hard surface, and then trim it down after the fact. You let it dry on that surface, and that way it never has the chance to warp or curl because it's already taped down. So now I'm going to do the exact same background, but this time I'm going to use a water brush. So my personal feeling is I like water brushes a little bit more than using just water with a paintbrush, because I can control how much water I'm adding by squeezing. So again, there is a little bit of a learning curve here if you've never used a water brush before, because if you squeeze too hard, you do kind of end up adding more water, and if you don't squeeze hard enough, you're not adding enough water. But once you start using it and you get the hang of it, it really is easy, because, and it's easy too if you crop or you travel, because you don't need to worry about cleanup or anything like that. Your water is contained inside this brush. But you can see I'm going ahead and I'm swishing back and forth there, and then I'm wiping off my brush continuously. That's just kind of pulling off the excess color, because I'm going from bottom to top. I'm pulling off that color because I didn't want to go back at the top and then add red. I want it to go from purple to red, not red, purple, red. So just make sure, and do this too with your paintbrush as well. Make sure you keep your brush clean, because the color will stay on there. So one of the things you definitely need whenever you're watercoloring is paper towels next to you to keep your brush nice and clean. And obviously clean water, stuff like that. So I'm doing the exact same thing, just with the heat gun. You can see I'm kind of testing it. I just want to make sure that it's dry. And also, if it isn't dry and you try to adhere this to something, it's not going to stick, because it has to be 100% dry for most adhesives to work. Otherwise, it's just going to pop right off. So, and I did show earlier, I just kind of sprayed some water to clean up. It's all water-based. So definitely protect your surface, but super duper easy to clean up. And they come right off the acrylic block. No problem whatsoever, just with some water. So now you can see I've grabbed my Misty stamping tool, and I am going to go ahead and I'm going to stamp this cute little image, and I'm going to use two types of ink. I'm using Catherine Pooler inks, and that's the I Pick You stamp set. So I kind of wanted to add like a little bit of green in there, so I added the melon ice towards the top. And then the rest of it is tiara. And you can see I just stamp it a couple times. And it might look a little blotchy right now, but as it dries, it really smooths out. And it's just kind of like a really cool effect. It's not just a plain stamped image. It's like a dual toned image there. And I think it's really fun. So I stamped that using my Misty. Now you can see I've got an acrylic block here. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stamp the little leaf for that little guy. And then the stem as well. Now you can use a Misty for this, or if you don't have a Misty, you can just use an acrylic black as well when you're doing the two-color stamping. It really is personal preference. I like the Misty because I do tend to make a lot of mistakes. Lots of times I don't always get that first perfect impression when I'm stamping. So I like using my Misty because then I can keep re-stamping it with no issues whatsoever. I don't have to worry about lining it up. So I die cut it. I have the coordinating die. And you can see that now it's die cut and it's nice and pretty. And now we're just going to go and assemble this card. So I know that the watercoloring did seem very basic, but trust me, we need to baby step this. We are going to go from step 1 all the way forward. That this may be really easy, but eventually we are going to get there, and you're going to be an expert at watercoloring with Spectrum Aqua markers. So we do want to start with something simple like background, so that's why we did that. And it's really, really pretty. And honestly, it may seem simple, but I use this all the time. I constantly use my aquas for backgrounds. I never even thought that I would use them as much as I do, but I honestly do. I use these markers too in almost every project I do. Almost every project that I'm able, I find myself reaching for my aquas. They're just something that I'm really comfortable with, and I really like using. So now you can see that I'm just adding a sentiment here. I'm just kind of lining it up on my Misty. It's another reason why I like using mine, just for the fact that, like I said, lots of times I kind of screw up. So here you can see that I have it aligned perfectly. And so now I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to ink that up, and I'm using that icing on the cake again. That was the same color that I used for the stem. I should mention I didn't say which color it was before, and I used the melon ice again for that leaf. So I'm just stamping I pick you, and you can see that my impression is not perfect. This is very common on watercolor cardstock because there is a lot of that texture. I should mention too that I use, on watercolor cardstock, there's usually kind of like a rougher side and a smoother side. They're both bumpy, but you can definitely tell the difference. I generally tend to use the smoother side because I'm stamping. So I want to make sure that my impression is as nice as it can be. You can definitely use the rougher side. It just is a little bit harder to get that really good impression. So now I'm just going to assemble the card, and I'm just going to use some 3D foam squares. I'm going to speed this up because this is pretty simple. It's just adding adhesive. If you don't have 3D foam, go ahead and use any type of tape runner, tape gun, whatever you want to do. You do not have to have the dimension on there. I just wanted to add it in. So you can see I'm just adding that on there. I thought it would give the card an extra little pop. And then to finish everything off, I am just using the Nouveau Crystal Drops. If you don't have this, you can use sequins or stickles or anything else you have in your little craft arsenal, and just let that dry and we're done. So you can see all 3 cards that I've made. So like I said, this is class 1. I will be back for a second class, and I'm going to teach you all of my tricks that I know. I am Spectrum Noir accredited. I didn't mention that earlier. So I do know what I'm doing. So I will see you next time. Thanks so much for watching.